Hello and welcome back. This is the Week 7 lecture. So today we're going to talk about those two examples of plays that I posted in this week's module. So just like we've done with our previous types of literature, we've already covered the basics of drama, the basic elements, we know what to look for. So now we can take a closer look at these two examples. One, we're going to read, obviously, The Wolves by Sarah DeLapp. I just posted the actual text of that play. So we're going to be reading it, not watching it. And as we talked about last week, that is a little bit of a limited approach because obviously plays were meant to be watched. They were meant to be performed. So just so we can get a little bit of a flavor for watching a performance, I also posted a performance of Hamlet, one of William Shakespeare's most famous plays. This is a recording of a stage play put on Broadway. So this is a 1964 Broadway performance starring a pretty famous British actor named Richard Burton. He's the one playing Hamlet. So we can watch that version. We're not actually going to read Hamlet, but we can watch that theatrical performance from the mid-60s to get a feel for what it's like to actually be in the audience and watch a play be performed. So we'll get a little bit of both experiences here. Oftentimes in school, our experience with drama is somewhat limited because we only get a chance to read plays. So I wanted to make sure that we could read a play and watch a play this week so we get a better idea of how drama works. So I want to stick with those three major categories that we talked about last week, the three major levels of drama. We have the text, we have the transformation, and then we have the performance, which mostly focuses on the actors on stage. So if we start with The Wolves by Sarah DeLapp, we can really only cover text, because we're not watching this play, we are only reading it. So with Hamlet, we'll be able to cover the other two areas, but for The Wolves, we have to just stick to the text. So this is a pretty contemporary poem. It was written, I believe, in 2015. I might be a year off. It might be 2016 or maybe 2014, but relatively recent. That's a big reason why I picked it. I also just think it's a very good play. It's very emotionally moving and compelling, despite a structure and a style that some of us might find somewhat unconventional, but really, as far as plays go, it's not that unusual to see what we see here, which is most of the information that we as the audience understand, most of it is delivered through dialogue. So we talked about this last week when we were discussing text. We said that in a play, most of what we're going to hear, or most of what we are going to read, in this case, will consist of the characters' dialogue. Different characters speaking to one another, having conversations. That's mostly what we get here. We have a lot of dialogue, and it takes a little bit of getting used to, because you might notice as you first start reading that the dialogue kind of overlaps. There are multiple conversations going on at the same time, but really that's a very realistic effect if you think about it, because when you have a large group of people, or in this case, a sports team consisting of a decent number of people, you're not just going to have one conversation. It's hard to have a bunch of people in just one conversation. And people don't necessarily wait until others stop talking before they start talking. You're going to have multiple conversations happening simultaneously. People will be talking over each other. People will be talking sort of at cross purposes with one another. And as this conversation's going on between these two people, maybe a couple of other people are actually talking about something different. But they're all in the same space, and they're all sort of talking at once. So that can be a little bit bewildering and confusing at first as a reader, but you'll get used to it. you will get used to it the more you read. And other than dialogue, the only other real sort of types of text that we see here really are those opening descriptions that we get. If you remember, at the very beginning of the play, we get descriptions of all of the characters. Now, we don't learn the names of these characters. We only refer to them by their numbers. So you sort of need to keep the characters straight. Some are probably a little bit more important than others, but you're going to be able to sort of get to know them primarily by listening to them talk. They're going to reveal a lot about themselves through their dialogue. And the only other way to really learn about them is to read those descriptions that we get for each character at the very beginning. So we learned that number 11, for example, plays the midfield. She's brainy, morbid, a budding elitist, apparently, thoughtful, and also 17. So we get the ages of all of these characters, and we get just a little overview of their personality. So we learned that the defense, that number 25, who also who plays defense, is like a classic coach's daughter. We learned that number 13, another midfielder, is, quote, into her wackiness, and she's 16. So we get some important details about the characters in those descriptions. And then underneath, we get a description of the setting. So we're learning really important info here about the characters and the setting. And we're going to need to remember some of that info throughout the rest of the play. So obviously, these are players on a girls' indoor soccer league team. They're all members of the team. And the play basically takes place on a series of Saturdays as we sort of observe them getting warmed up for their games. So it's an interesting way to sort of think about a play, and it's going to give us a chance to get into those three Greek unities as well. But we get to know this team. We get to know the team dynamics. We get to know the individual players on the team. We're not really getting coaches. We only have one parent appear. Now, she does play a pretty important role near the end. The soccer mom, we can mention her a little bit later. But for the most part, the only real characters here, the only well-developed characters who we actually spend a lot of time with are the players on the team. And they're all teenagers. They're all in high school, sophomores, juniors, maybe seniors in high school. So those are our characters. We learn a little bit about them. And when it comes to the setting, we learn that we are in an indoor soccer field, and that's pretty much all we're going to see. The back wall is plexiglass. We can see fans and like fluorescent lights maybe stretching throughout the field. But yeah, the field is said to kind of stretch on endlessly. So that's part of the description that we get at the beginning, so we can visualize this setting, so we can understand where we are. And the setting doesn't really change, and the characters that we start with are the ones that we stick with. So a lot of this info that we get on page 1 is the equivalent of what we would get with exposition in a work of fiction. So if we were reading a novel or a short story, a lot of this basic information would be delivered to us by a narrator, maybe an omniscient third-person narrator, or maybe a first-person, more direct narrator. But we're going to learn a little bit about the main characters and about the setting early on. That information is going to be given to us early so we can understand what's happening in the story, in the narrative. So that's kind of what we get here, but obviously it's a play, and a lot of plays don't have narrators, so this information is just given to us up front, so we are armed with it throughout our reading. So let's talk about the three Greek unities. We mentioned these last week, and at least a couple of them are at play here, are at work in this play. So we notice that we're not exactly unified in terms of time. Remember, the ancient Greeks thought that the running time of a play should roughly correspond to the amount of time that the events depicted in that play would take to play out. But here, we're not just contained within the running time of this play. The action takes place on a series of winter Saturdays. I think we might actually cover 6 weeks. I think we start in week 1 and we work our way up through week 6. So we're going through their season. They're playing games every weekend. A lot of you played organized sports. Maybe you still do. So you can relate to their schedule. And we are sticking to their game schedule. We never actually watch them play games. We are observing their warm-ups before the games. And they always take place on Saturdays, presumably at about the same time on Saturdays, but we're following them through a series of Saturdays throughout the winter months as their season progresses. So we're not quite unified in terms of time, but when it comes to place and when it comes to action, I do think we have a sort of traditional unity at work. The action is unified. We're always watching them warm up before a game. That doesn't really change, even though the games and the weeks change. The actual action that they are participating in doesn't really change from week to week. So the action pretty much is the same, and as we've already established, the setting, the location is the same. We don't see them outside of practice. We don't see them at their homes. We don't see them at school. We don't see them socializing with friends on the weekend. We only see them on the practice field, at this indoor facility, warming up before games on Saturdays. So in terms of place, we are unified. The action's pretty unified. And even though we do, the time does take place over 6 weeks, the time of day and the day of the week remains the same as we follow their schedule. So DeLapp, our playwright, the author of this play, you can see her name on the PDF, Sarah DeLapp. She's a sort of pretty well-known, pretty well-regarded younger playwright working right now. She is making use of at least a couple of those old Greek unities. Like we know, not all playwrights do. Not even Shakespeare always stuck to them in his plays, but many still do. And even some movies, some filmmakers also utilize the 3 Greek unities. It can be kind of an easy way to structure your narrative. And we see a lot of that here. We don't see different acts. We talked about last week how it's kind of traditional to have 5 acts in a play. That's how the ancient Greeks did it. And that's how people like Shakespeare did it back in Elizabethan England when drama sort of made a big comeback back in the 15 and 1600s. But we don't have separate acts here with the wolves, but we do have a lot of individual scenes. We have multiple scenes. And when it comes to the plot, we don't necessarily follow that traditional plot triangle, but there is a sense of rising action as we get to know the players, as we go through the first few weeks. Again, we're learning about what's happening in the players' lives through their dialogue. We're learning about the sort of pecking order on the team, the different relationships, right? Number 7 and number 14 are friends. So we're learning more about their friendship. We're learning more about some of the other relationships at work on the team. So even though this might not strike us as a traditional plot with lots of, really dynamic, super exciting action, we do get action. But the action is delivered largely through the dialogue and through the stretches and the warm-ups that they're doing. But the more important information is usually delivered through their dialogue. So we do have a lot of rising action, and then we have a major event, perhaps even the climax, that takes place off stage. a major sort of emotional event that has a big impact on the team. I don't want to give it away, but it involves one of the players on the team. And there were some other important events prior to that. There's actually a lot of important events that get revealed to us, but something big that affects the entire team because it involves sort of a bad situation involving one particular player, sort of tragic situation that will obviously affect the entire team. That happens off stage. But we learn about it, we hear about it, and then we get a very sort of maybe an ambiguous, kind of a strange resolution. So remember, after the climax, with most plots, it's not over with the climax. We usually have a resolution that follows the climax. That's where we kind of tie up the loose ends. We might get a sense for what's going to happen to the characters next, and we kind of, conclude the narrative. That is the true conclusion, the true end of the narrative is the resolution. So here, the resolution always strikes me as a little bit strange and maybe a little bit less than clear. So we have, soccer mom, we have a sort of unified team chant. They seem to be unified. They seem to be together. They're getting ready to go and play a game. But what does it all mean? And what do we make of the final scene, that resolution that follows the tragic news that we're sort of able to piece together? But again, we don't see it. It happens off stage. So try to figure all that out. Important stuff is happening, particularly at the end. Try to figure out the tragedy. It's not maybe directly stated in the text, but if you're paying close attention, some of the players are talking about it. You should be able to figure it out, and then figure out what you think about soccer mom's appearance, the orange slices, that final team chant, and the way the play ends. So, like I was saying earlier, I picked this play because I thought a lot of you might be able to relate to it. I mean, I think Delap's just good anyway, but in terms of subject matter and the age range of a lot of these characters, I thought this would appeal to at least some of us. Or at least some of us might have previously had experiences back in high school. If we're not currently this age, maybe previously, we can look back on similar types of experiences. So again, these are just kind of regular teenage girls living in some kind of typical suburban place on a soccer team, talking about a lot of things that concern teenagers. So as you're reading, I want you to try to sort of evaluate the realism here. How accurately is Delap, our playwright, sort of portraying this particular age group? The sort of team dynamic present with a lot of youth sports. How accurately is she capturing the teenagers' voices? I want you to pay attention to how these characters talk. It might put us a little bit in mind of Nilda, that short story that we read weeks ago by Diaz, narrated, a first-person narrator, narrated by a young guy, teenager, Dominican American from New Jersey, and it's very much in his authentic voice. A lot of profanity, a lot of slang. And I remember reading some of our discussion posts, and some of us said, yeah, that does kind of strike us as pretty accurate or a pretty realistic portrait of how a lot of people in that age group might talk, especially when they're with their friends, when they're with peers. So let's do the same thing here. Let's evaluate the accuracy, the realism of the dialogue. These characters, how realistic are the characters? Because I think Delap is definitely trying to capture something real, something relatable. So let's decide how successful she is with that. Okay, so that's really all we can do with the Wolves. We can just appreciate the text. But again, read the whole thing. It might seem a little bit daunting. I know it's 163 pages, but it's a really fast read. It will not take you long once you get started. And again, once you learn how to navigate those crisscrossing threads of dialogue, once you're able to navigate all the different conversations, I think you'll be surprised at how quick and fun of a read it really is. But there's real emotional impact by the end. So we can think about that as well. Okay, so moving over to Shakespeare and Hamlet, a very famous play. Even if you haven't read it, even if you haven't watched it, you probably have some idea. You've probably seen some version, some reference to it at some point. Hamlet is, of course, a young prince living in medieval Denmark. His father, the former king, has been murdered. And the play is sort of kind of a detective story to some extent, as Hamlet's able to sort of unravel the mystery of who killed his father. And not giving anything away here, hopefully he comes to learn that it is his uncle, his father's brother, who has since taken the throne and has married Hamlet's father's wife, Hamlet's own mother. So he gets on the case. He eventually is able to uncover the mystery, but the play is really about Hamlet and his whole sort of mental state. He's going through a lot. He's going through a very complex process of learning and growing. People kind of forget, because a lot of movie versions cast like 45-year-old men as Hamlet, but he's supposed to be a teenager. He's a college student. He's supposed to be a young guy. So he's really wrestling with all of the responsibility that's been placed on him as he's trying to figure out what happens to his father. And what kind of sets the plot in motion is the ghost of his father visits him early in the play and essentially tells him, what happened and what he needs to do. So it's really more of a question of, can Hamlet take action? He's kind of paralyzed at times. He's not always sure quite what to do or how to act. He knows what he wants to do. He knows he wants to seek vengeance, but he's not always quite sure how to go about doing it. So, very famous, one of the most famous plays in the English language. So once again, a lot of the information does get delivered to us from dialogue, right? Once again, we are hearing the characters talk. We're hearing multiple conversations, but also Hamlet has some monologues. So sometimes Hamlet is just talking to himself. He's not addressing the other characters, and presumably they're not able to hear him when he's going through these monologues. So he has some famous soliloquies, to be or not to be. There's others throughout the play where he's just talking. Sometimes he's alone, sometimes he's kind of off to the side, but he's talking to himself, and obviously the audience can hear. He also has some asides where he's actually, at times, maybe even addressing the audience, not other characters on stage. So, pretty typical in that regard. As far as the Greek unities, we know Shakespeare does not always adhere to those, and he's really not here either. He's not sticking to the 3 Greek unities. The action takes place in a few different locations and over a fair amount of time. Not a ton of time elapses, but we're not talking about 2 hours or an hour and a half. This, the action, the plot takes place, I would say, at least over the course of maybe a few months. Okay, we're not covering a ton of time, but it's more than just one day or a couple of hours. As terms of the action itself, it is very different things are happening, but it is kind of self-contained. Like, what Hamlet sets out to do at the beginning is arguably achieved by the end. A lot of loose ends are tied up by the end of the play. So the action is kind of unified and self-contained in the sense that we see it start, we see it reach its climax, and then we see it end, and there's really nothing left to do. There's no sequel, there's no cliffhanger. It's resolved by the end. So maybe he follows that unity, but then when it comes to location, setting, he's not really unified there, although a lot of the action, probably the majority of the action, takes place in Elsinore Castle. That's, Hamlet's residence, essentially. But we're not always inside the castle. We do go to a few other places, and occasionally we're just right outside the castle. So we're not always inside. We're in different rooms. We're in different parts of the castle, and sometimes we're not in the castle at all, but frequently we are. So it is worth noting that a lot of the action does take place in the same location. In terms of plot, we have a pretty traditional plot triangle kind of plot here, but not entirely. We get some exposition. If we're watching this performance, we actually get some exposition at the very beginning in text form. Once again, giving us the info that we need to kind of get us into the story, to understand where we are, a little bit of what's going on. Then we have the rising action, a lot of different rising action, but remember the appearance of the dead king's ghost. That's really the complication. Remember, with rising action, you're always going to have some kind of complication or conflict that's introduced. Now, in the wolves, there's several different sources of conflict. There's a few different complications. We might view one as being maybe the biggest, or a couple as being bigger than others. But in Hamlet, the big sort of complication, the big conflict that gets introduced is largely delivered by the ghost. When he shows up and talks to Hamlet, that's really where we get a lot of forward momentum, but that's also where the central problem is presented to Hamlet. That he's got to figure out, what are you going to do? You're supposed to take action. The ghost of the king is calling on you to take action, but he's not exactly giving you a play-by-play. He's not giving you a script. You have to figure out, Hamlet has to figure out how to do it. So that's the central problem that he's confronting. He wants to take action. He wants to seek vengeance, but he doesn't always quite know how to do it, or he's struggling to get started. He's got a lot of internal conflict. He's dealing with a lot of problems that are contained within himself, and he's also dealing with problems connected to his uncle, his mother, and other relationships that he has. So we got a big complication introduced pretty early on, and then we eventually have our climax during a very bloody, a very eventful scene that starts with some fencing, some sword fighting, and it ends with Laertes, Hamlet, Gertrude, and Claudius all dead. So that's the climax. That's the peak sort of moment. The peak moment of action in our plot, but the play doesn't end there. We have a resolution that occurs next, where another character comes on stage, kind of observes what has happened, makes a few comments, wraps things up, and we reach our conclusion. So for the most part, Hamlet is using that traditional plot triangle, where we start with exposition, rising action, including some kind of complication or conflict getting introduced. Then we hit the peak, that tip of the triangle, the peak action, that's the climax, and then a brief resolution to tie things up at the end. So that pretty much covers text. Now, if we're thinking about transformation, now we can do some new stuff. We couldn't consider transformation with the wolves, but we can with this performance of Hamlet. So I don't know who the director is. We don't need to worry about who the director is of this particular performance. You can always look it up. But it's not important to really get wrapped up with names. But clearly, this play has a director. So I want you to notice a few things. Notice the stage design. Notice the props, okay? Notice the way the actors move, the way they're sort of framed, the way they kind of coordinate their movements on stage. All of that is part of the transformation. Remember what we said last week. Transformation's all about that process of taking a written text and turning it into a visual performance that people can actually sit and watch. So there's a lot of different components to that transformation, but set design, what the actual set on stage looks like, that might be the most obvious, because again, we're thinking about visuals. What do we see? What are we looking at? Well, we're looking at the stage. So what's on the stage? Some plays have really elaborate, complex set design, really intricate sets with lots of moving parts. We don't exactly get that here. We have a pretty bare bones, kind of spare, sparse, almost Spartan look up on stage. Not a lot to really draw our eye, but there are some things that we can look at. So we see sort of like a raised section sort of near the back of the stage with steps leading up to it. Okay, so not all of the stage exists on one level. There is that raised level with steps. So we see that. We often see a table and maybe a few chairs a little bit closer to the front of the stage, or maybe at some different spots. During the climactic fencing scene, we do see some props in the form of swords, but we don't see many others like that. The costumes are another thing we can pay attention to. That's obviously another thing that we are looking at. So remember, Hamlet is supposed to be set during the Middle Ages. So a little interesting background, not to get too far into it, but we think that this play comes from an old Scandinavian legend, the legend of Amleth, who was a sort of medieval, again, a sort of a prince from the medieval period, and there were a lot of texts written about this guy, this particular legend. It was probably turned into a play during the Elizabethan era, but maybe Shakespeare wasn't the first to do it. There's some debate. Some scholars think that other playwrights, other English language playwrights, had already adapted this particular legend into a stage play, and Shakespeare's just following that sort of tradition. So this legend had been around for a long time. It comes from the Middle Ages. The time period that we're supposed to be in terms of setting is also the Middle Ages. So we're talking like 1000s, 1100s, like a long time ago, even several hundreds of years earlier than Shakespeare's time. So that's our setting, that's our historical setting. But if you notice the costumes, they're not necessarily in the style of the Middle Ages. The costumes that we see the characters wear really should put us in mind of like the late 19th century or the early 20th century. So like the late 1800s or the early 1900s. So a lot of adaptations of these old famous plays will do that. They'll perhaps change certain aspects of the setting. They might modernize the time period a little bit, or they might even move the location. So here we are getting costumes that at least kind of give us the idea that we are modernizing the time period, that we're moving to a more recent time period, but still not contemporary with our own time, still a little bit old in our eyes. You can also think about the lighting. Lighting is also a part of transformation. We don't have cameras here. I mean, somebody was recording the performance, but it's not like a movie in the sense that we can think about camera work, but we can think about lighting, which is an element that we often see in TV and movies. So how does the lighting work on stage? How are the actors lit? How is the stage lit? What role do shadows play? You can ask yourselves all of those questions as well. So yeah, I kind of forgot to mention this with text, but we do have 5 acts here if we're thinking about plot. Just to go back to plot, that is the ancient Greek model, and each act contains multiple scenes. So just remember that distinguishes Hamlet from the Wolves. I just forgot to mention that we do have 5 acts and a whole bunch of scenes. But then going back to the stage, the transformation. What does the stage look like? So yeah, think about the set, think about props, think about costumes, and think about lighting. You can also just think about the way the actors look. I mean, part of that is costumes, hair, maybe even makeup. But also think about how the characters move. How do we see the characters? Think about movement, think about spatial relationships, and we can also think about the spatial relationships of the stage itself. So like we said last time, the spatial dimensions of theaters, like the actual physical structure of the theater where the plays are held, those dimensions have changed over time. So in the modern day, we have what's called the proscenium, which is like kind of like a box, right? It's almost like we're inside somebody's house, we're inside the room of somebody's home, and we can sort of see three sides. We can see the back wall, we have a sense of two walls on the side, and then we, the audience, are sitting where that fourth wall would be. But instead of that fourth wall, it's us looking inside, watching the actors, watching the action. So think about the spatial dimensions that we see here in this Broadway theater in New York City in the 60s. We can really get a sense of being in the audience and watching everything transpire up on stage. And the final level or dimension of drama that we need to consider here is performance. And that obviously means the actors. So again, we don't get this with the wolves. We don't get this when we're just reading plays. We actually have to watch a play to be able to evaluate or analyze the performance of individual actors. So I will post a little bit more info about the cast, but you guys, just for now, you should be paying attention, obviously, to Richard Burton, who plays Hamlet. He is the protagonist. He's the star. He was a famous actor back in the 60s. He's obviously dead now. He was famous both in England. I believe he was Welsh. So he was famous throughout Great Britain, but also famous in America. He was married to Elizabeth Taylor, if any of you know who she was, a famous actress from that same time period. They were sort of in the tabloids a lot. They had a lot of gossip written about them. They had a very tumultuous relationship. I think they were married maybe multiple times, but didn't stay married any of those times. So Burton was a celebrity. He wasn't just a well-known actor. He was also just a well-known celebrity. Even people who didn't go to see plays on Broadway knew who Richard Burton was. He was also a popular movie actor. So even if you never saw him in a play, you probably saw him in movies. So he's famous, and you can always Google him or look at his Wikipedia page. He's a pretty interesting guy. But think about some of the other key roles. Think about some of the other performances, some of the other actors and actresses. Let's think about how they're bringing their characters to life. Let's think about how they talk, how they move, how they look. That's all part of these visual elements, right? They go along with performance and transformation. One final thought on acting that I want to leave you with as we watch the play, or maybe go back to watch it again after this lecture. Remember that theatrical acting is different from what we often see with movies or TV acting. Theatrical acting has to be a little bit different because they are projecting, they are performing for a live audience. And that's sometimes the case with shows. A lot of old sitcoms would be taped in front of a live audience, but that's less common today, and movies virtually never have a live audience. So the actors on stage in a play, they have to make sure that their voices are heard and their gestures are seen by everybody in that theater, even people all the way in the back on that very back row. So sometimes if we're more accustomed to movies and shows, and that's the kind of acting we normally see, we might feel like stage actors are kind of overacting. We might feel like they're kind of laying it on too thick. They're talking too loudly. They're gesticulating too wildly. We might think, oh, that's not very realistic. That's not how people usually talk or behave. But again, they have to reach that entire live audience. They have to talk loud. They have to be loud. They have to be very visible at all times. So it is different. It is a different style, a different brand of acting. And unlike movie actors or actors in a TV show, actors on stage, they don't get multiple takes. If you screw up your line while doing a scene for a movie, they can just say cut and you do it again and again and again until you get it right. But obviously up on stage, if you flub your line or if you trip and fall or you do something wrong, there's really not anything the director or anybody else can do to hide it from the audience. So most actors will tell you, and maybe some of you have some experience doing some stage acting, maybe in school, a lot of professional actors will say that it's harder. Acting on stage is harder. There's less margin for error. You have to project. You have to be, doing it for everybody in that audience, and you don't get second and third chances. And just the nature of it. You're out there, you're doing the performance for 2 hours every night. If you ever watch a movie get made, like actors are doing their scenes all broken up over a long period of time. So on one day, an actor might just do a handful of scenes, just, a few hours of work, and then they're going to do some more scenes later this week, and then next week, and then, shooting on a movie will take place over months. Whereas stage play, you got to get up there and perform night after night for new audiences, and you have to do it in a way that makes an impression on everybody. So keep that in mind as you're evaluating the acting. You might want to track some of the differences that you notice between the acting here and the acting that we might see in a movie or a show. But again, I'll post our cast so we can talk about specific actors and analyze some of their performance. Okay, so again, with the Wolves, just focus on the text, focus primarily on characters, dialogue. We can think a little bit about the setting and certainly the Greek unities, which are in effect. But we can really stay focused primarily on theme, characters, plot, and dialogue, much like we would with a short story or a novel. But with Hamlet, let's really think about it more visually. Let's focus more on transformation and performance, since we are watching it, not reading it. Okay, so this is it for drama. I hope you guys enjoy the examples, and I will see you next week as we get ready for our first critical response paper of the semester. So next week we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to talk more about analysis. We're going to talk a little bit more about some nuts and bolts, just sort of how to conduct the kind of analysis we want for our first critical response paper. And we're going to talk a little bit more about reading strategies. How can we take notes? How can we identify some key elements in the stuff that we read so we can analyze those elements later? So next week is going to be a lot of hands-on reading and writing strategies. So I will see you then. Let me know if you have any questions.